All right, we are live. Probably need these glasses this time. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome if you are new. Um, Today, I'm going to talk about death. Um, I did a series of blog posts about 20 years ago. Just one day, I just sat down and wrote a funny little story about this guy who's having a great day. And he meets a young woman who has been following him around, kind of keeping at a distance as they're walking. And he notices her and he finally turns around and says, "See, you're being kind of shy, but you seem interested in me. And who are you? But you look great and you want to talk." And her response is, "Oh, you can see me." And he says, "Yeah, I can see you. You're really pretty, and I'd like to get to know you." And she says, "What do I look like?" And he says, "You're pretty. That's a beautiful dress. That's a pretty hat. And, can I buy you a cup of coffee?" And she eventually explains to him that she's death. And, they go back and forth. He's like, "Yeah, sure you are. I mean, in death's supposed to be a skeletal guy with a sword." And she says, "It's not a sword, it's a scythe. And actually, it's not always a skeleton. It's whatever people think I should look like." And it's kind of curious that you think I should be pretty. And so they kind of hit it off. And there's several installments in the story. It goes on and on. I thought about making it into a little novella, a little short book. And it's mostly done, but I'm trying to figure out how to end it properly. Um, uh, there's a lot of sex in it. There's a lot of comedy. They do all these crazy things together, and she keeps not killing him. And yeah, you can just imagine what happens. So when I was writing that book and thinking about death as an interesting character, and then death, of course, as a phenomenon, right? Everyone dies, everything dies. The cost of life is death, essentially. And people obsess over death, and sometimes they waste their lives obsessing over death. So one of the things I had to do was for narrative purposes, I had to look up how many people die every day. So it's kind of a number I've had rattling around in my head. Now, like I said, I started this a long time ago. Like I said, 20 years ago. I wrote the first installment of this, and that's when I looked up the number. And the number, just for curiosity, back then, the number was 104,000 people a day die. 104,000. Now, offsetting that, of course, there's a certain number of people that are born. And I don't know what the number was 20 years ago because I didn't bother looking it up. Probably should have. But these days, the numbers have increased quite a bit. I mean, we're always growing the population, right? The number of births exceeds the number of deaths. And we know that because the population is growing. We've gone from, I think it was 2.5 billion people during the time of the Kennedy administration, so, early 60s, to about 8 billion now. 8 billion people now, so 2.5 to 8 billion. So the population has been growing. Therefore, we know that the number of births exceeds the number of deaths. That's why your population grows. And that's interesting, right? That's an interesting figure. Good thing to know. I just looked it up, and these days, according to Google, there are now 385,000 births daily. And when you have 8 billion people as opposed to 2.5 billion people, you would expect the number of births to go up. It's kind of a one-to-one relationship. There's more women, and more women have more babies. And these days we have 150,000 deaths daily. That's a lot of people, right? Dying. But yeah, let's face it, the vast majority of those people are dying of, old age, right? They pass on, like we like to say. They pass on. They get old. They pass on. And, they've lived a full life. And, there's a certain number of deaths that we would like to avoid, like, murders, childhood illnesses, war, right? but it probably doesn't change the number much. It's probably still going to be 150,000 deaths a day or thereabouts. And if I was death, I would know the exact. She knows everything about it. Now, 385,000 births daily, 150,000 deaths daily. That leaves an excess, and that's of course the population growth. There's an excess of 200. I'm looking these numbers up here. There's 235,000 excess births. That's births minus deaths. Okay, excess births beyond replacement rate. So we are beyond replacement rate by 235,000 people daily. That's how the population is growing. 235,000 people, new people a day. That's 85 million per year in excess, meaning births minus deaths. 85 million per year. And 10 years, that's 850 million people. So you see why the population grows. I remember seeing a statistic somewhere that the population doubles every 30 years or something like that. I wish I had the number in front of me, but there is a doubling rate. And of course, we've doubled a couple of times since the Kennedy administration, right? We doubled from 2 to 4 and then from 4 to 8 billion. And so how long has it been since the Kennedy administration? 60 years. So yeah, doubling rate of every 30 years or so. There you go. So there's now 8,000 million people because we've been increasing the population through excess births over deaths. And increasing population is based on a finite planet is not sustainable. Now you can throw technology at it, and we have been throwing technology at that number. We've been throwing fossil fuels at that number. And so now you're starting to detect where I'm going with this. We've been throwing fossil fuels at death. Using fossil fuels, we've created entire networks of healthcare, hospitals, pediatric wards, also all kinds of immunology that we give children against typical childhood diseases, many of which were fatal in their time, not anymore. And if a child does get sick, we have entire ICUs and pediatric wards and all these things. The number of children that are lost in birth has gone down significantly, as well as the number of women lost giving birth. So just overall, we are really handling as best as we can infant mortality, early childhood mortality, and maternal mortality, the deaths of mothers in childbirth. So of course, the number of successful births has gone up, and at the other end, the death part, where people are living longer. The average life span 300 years ago was what, 45, 50? I'm not talking about the King of England and the Queen of Spain. I'm talking about the average dude, right? The dude and dudette and their families of 12, and then they had 50% infant mortality. So most of their children never reached adulthood. And it was tough, right? There was a lot of people died what we would now consider young. Someone dying at 45 today would be considered a tragedy. How did that happen? Wait, that's a failure of the system. Well, something went wrong that person died at 40 or 45. But back in the day, that was pretty common. And of course, it was also true that a lot of women died in childbirth. So there was, lots of families being raised by a stepmother or by grandparents or, whoever was available to pick up the slack. So my point is that our population is growing, and people debate what is the carrying capacity of the earth. And you'll hear numbers like, oh, well, it must, I've even heard numbers like 1 trillion, that this earth can handle 1 trillion people. That's what is 1 trillion? Okay, 1 billion is 8,000 million. So I guess 1 trillion is 8 million million. Did I get that right? Yeah, I think so. 8 million million. That's 1 trillion. People say, oh yeah, we're not stuck at these tiny numbers like 8 billion. We can go much higher than that. We can go 20 billion. We can do 30 billion. We can do, a whole lot of billions. And biologist, I just don't see it. Look at what's happening to the world. Not even considering climate change and global heating. Just set that aside for a moment. Look at what we're doing with the world. There are countries that can't feed themselves, including, just so you recognize the scope of the problem, the United Kingdom can't feed itself, has to import food. They don't, they never talk about that, except that they sometimes talk about it, without fossil fuels to, bring food to them. And of course, this is excess food. So somewhere in the world, there's some country with a bunch of agriculture that's creating more food than they can personally eat in their country. So they're able to export it. And the UK comes along and says, oh yeah, we could use some of that. And they buy it. So there has to be an excess somewhere. And then you have to transport it across the planet to the United Kingdom, and then they can eat it. Because right now, today, they can't grow enough food to feed themselves. When did that situation start? Hundreds of years ago? Who knows? So we at the 8,000 million, we're not really doing it right. It's not sustainable. And I have estimated on this channel before that, back in the 1400s, the 1500s, maybe there was 200 million people on Earth, 200 million. If I just do round figures, and because it makes the math easier, call it 800 million, then that's 1/10 of the current population. And 800 million would be extremely generous. So what is it that this planet can really support? A quarter of that? So, 2 million? That's not a quarter. 800 million, a quarter of that would be 200 million. Could this planet support 200 million people these days? I don't know. That sounds like a stretch, given what the crappy shape the planet is in. We've cleared all the forests. We've aridified a lot of the arable land that we used to count on having. A lot of the land has been salted. A lot of the aquifers have been drained, and those take millions of years to refill. We've pumped up the water out of the ground. We've pumped so much water out of the ground in some places that the cities and landscapes are sinking, and they're at risk of going below sea level in a lot of places. So we've kind of screwed the pooch. We've used all this technology and the Iron Age and pumps and electricity and nuclear power. We've done all these things, and we've kind of screwed up the planet for our future uses. And at this point, without constant inputs and increasing inputs of fossil fuels, 8,000 million people is just not in the cards. Maybe 1% of that, right? Which would be 80 million people. Maybe 1% of our current population, 80 million people, is what this planet can really support. Now, I'm going to get to the question of having children or not. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to set up that we are in really big trouble. We're in really big trouble. If sometime in the next 20 years, over the next 20 years, if we really do stop burning fossil fuels, then in the 20th year, during this time when we are cutting back our consumption of fossil fuels, after 20 years of that continuous process, if we get to zero consumption of fossil fuels, not net zero, not some weird math spreadsheet joke that you pull, actual zero, meaning no oil is coming out of the ground, no coal is coming out of the ground, and no natural gas is coming out of the ground. Actual zero, not net zero. Not monkey business with numbers. Actual zero. Fossil fuel consumption of any kind. Then as we stop burning fossil fuels and we no longer have the food surpluses, and we no longer have the electricity production, and we no longer have as much manufacturing, and we no longer have as much transportation, and then 20 years from now, or 20 years from wherever we start, let's say we start now, 20 years from now, so 2044, then at that point we need to be the population of humanity needs to be at the number that this planet can support us without fossil fuels. We have to be at that number, whatever that number is. And if you think the number is 800 million, then and that's 10% of the current population. That's still a massive die-off. And I think that you're probably going to be real disappointed. I don't think that this planet can support 800 million people ever in the future of eternity. It's done. I don't know that it can even support 80 million people. We could try, but it's going to be difficult. Now, our excess births add 85 million people per year. That's 235,000 excess daily births times 365. 85 million people per year. At some point, 85 million people needs to be the population of Earth. And if we start reducing our fossil fuel consumption starting today, then we need to be at something like 80 million people in 20 years from now. We're adding 80 million people per year. We need to be at a total population of 80 million people per year just to be sustainable and resilient without fossil fuels. And that's allowing that it's going to be hot. There's going to be violent weather. There's probably going to be violent wars over the last of the resources as people start running around looking for food. There's going to be various pandemics. I mean, it's just a hellscape. The only thing that's not going to be there are, actual zombie apocalypse. It'll be everything else. All the things that humans have ever experienced will all happen over the next 20 years because somehow we have to start cutting back on our fossil fuel consumption until we get to zero. And if you allow 20 years to do that, which is pretty generous, because in 20 years, we're going to be looking at 5 degrees C above a pre-industrial baseline, 5 degrees C. That's really hot, people. That's very, very hot. We're going to have significant sea level rise. We're going to have significant uninhabitable Earth. Okay. It's just going to be a hellscape. Even if everything else works out, we don't have any refugee crises. We don't have any food shortages. We don't have any nuclear wars. We don't have anything bad happens just outside of the temperature. It's still going to be really fucking hot. It's going to be so hot you can't breathe when you go outside. And your crops are going to die. And if you haven't had a food crisis up to now, up to 5 degrees C above pre-industrial baseline, then you will at that point. And there's nothing to say we stop there. We may go straight to 10. Now, it may take us longer than 20 years to go to 10, but I'm pretty sure that by 20 years from now, we'll be at 5 degrees C and it's over. 20 years from now, it's over. We will have, if we haven't stopped burning fossil fuels, then the situation on the surface of the planet will be so bad that you won't be able to extract fossil fuels out of the ground. No one will be able to do the work. It's outdoors work, and you won't be able to do it. The equipment won't run. You can't get the electricity. There's so many problems with electricity transmission at temperatures like that. Substations will be blowing up. Power plants won't operate in the heat. Nuclear power plants will have to be shut down because it's too hot to operate. It's just going to be one thing after another. And by the time you get to 5 degrees C, you're done. You're finished. You can't even extract fossil fuels anymore. And that might take 20 years. So this idea that by 20 years, we really need to be off of fossil fuels and figuring out another way to live our lives, that's probably going to happen whether we want it to or not. It's just going to be untenable. Now, I want to state again, in 20 years, we need to be at the carrying capacity of this Earth for humans without fossil fuels. And, my best guess is that's, 80 million people. We are currently bringing into the world 85 million people per year, excess above natural deaths. 85 million per year. We need to have a total population, not an additional population every year, a total population of 80 million by the time we get off of fossil fuels. Now, at that point, 20 years from now, that's what I'm projecting. It's just numbers, right? That means we have zero births because we can't be adding 85 million per year when we really need the entire population to be 80 million. Now, if you start paring down from 8,000 million people to 80 million people, if you go from this to this, if you go from this 8,000 million to this 80 million in 20 years, because that's on deck. That's the project. Get off of fossil fuels and get down to a population that's resilient and stable and can cope without fossil fuels. That's 1% of the current population we're talking about. That means you're going to have, and this is basic math, 8,000 million divided by 20 years. You're going to have 400 million excess deaths per year. 400 million excess deaths per year. 400 million. That's the population of the United States. That's actually quite a bit more than the population of the entire United States of America dying every year. To get us to, in 20 years, to get us down to a figure that is probably sustainable, meaning these people won't be suffering much without fossil fuels. And that's just a guess. It may be smaller than that. But I like these figures. They work for me, okay? I keep these in my head. 8,000 million people, but in 20 years, we have to be down to 80 million. And that's 99% die-off. So that doesn't leave much room. All right? Currently, we are adding 85 million per year, excess births. The excess births must go to zero. And the contraction of the population, not growing, the actual contraction of the population needs to be 400 million per year. We have to stop excess births. And then on the other side, contract by 400 million per year. Now we're going to have some help doing that. It's going to come from physics. Global heating is going to make it impossible to grow food in many regions on this earth. There's probably 4,000 million people, 4 billion people living in places, equatorial regions right now, that are going to be simply straight up uninhabitable in probably 10 years. So those people get to go first. And most of those people, according to studies, have no mobility. They have nowhere to go and no way to get there. And they will simply die in place over the next 20 years. Nearly the entire population of Earth, 8,000 million people, will die in place, leaving approximately 80 million people, 1% of the current population. And 80 million people, one guess would be that the planet can actually support 80 million people without constant, introductions of fossil fuels to grow the crops and move the water and bring the fertilizers and bring the electricity and the harvesting and the processing and, everything you have to do, pesticides, everything you have to do to create food the way we create it now. It's all done with fossil fuels, 100%. Nobody is pulling a plow with a horse, except maybe in, some part of Africa or something. Those people actually have a story. They never gave up their horse and plow. They can just continue doing that. Maybe they'll be fine. But that's not millions of people. In Central Africa, plowing with an ox, what, a couple 100,000 people, 1 million people, maybe tops, not even, 200,000-300,000 people are surviving with an ox and a plow. And everybody else is living off of fossil fuels. Tractors and trucks and transportation and jets and artificial fertilizers and artificial pesticides. It's just the artificial irrigation, pumping water thousands of miles, pumping water from hundreds of feet deep into the ground and pumping it up onto the surface, depleting the aquifers. That's all fossil fuels. All of it, 100% of it. 100% of it is fossil fuels. And without that, you can't support 8,000 million people. That's it. One and done. That's it. That's the statement. What can you support? 1% of that? 80 million people? Maybe. Maybe not 80 million, but maybe 8 million. 1/10 of 1%. We're in a really bad spot, people. We're in a very bad, extremely bad situation. This situation is about as bad as I could possibly imagine. I'm a science fiction writer. I have an active imagination. But if I was writing science fiction about the end of the world, I couldn't do much better than this. And how are we going to lose? How? in the hell are we going to lose 400 million people per year? The equivalent of the United States of America's population, actually in excess of that, every year. One United States of America every year dying. Every year for 20 years. Every year for 20 years. How in the world? However, what part of human history, what part of any history of the earth, any living thing, anywhere, in any time, in any era, any epoch, ever had to undergo that kind of a contraction? And yet, that's what's on deck. That shit is on deck for us. Now, maybe you'll innovate, and maybe you'll have AI, and maybe you'll have other, who knows what you're going to do. But I don't think you're going to do it in the next 20 years. I don't think you're going to change jack in the next 20 years. You're not going to change anything. And if you do, it's not going to have any impact on 400 million people per year are going to die as we wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, because we have to do that. And you're not going to have any influence on that number. None, zero. It's too big of a number. You can save some of the elites, right? Elon Musk can finally get to Mars. Okay, I guess he's all right. And, Jeff Bezos, he'll have his private floating city out in the middle of the Atlantic. I guess he'll be okay. Him and his entourage, him and his 500 best friends, Okay, so there's, a couple thousand here, another 400 or 500 over there. And, some wealthy oligarchs from Russia and some other wealthy oligarchs from South America. And, they'll be scattered around. They'll be up in the high tops of the mountains. They'll be in the, sheltered valleys. They'll have their castles. And, maybe 20,000, 50,000 elites will find some way to live their best life with fossil fuels, with electric cars, with their own private nuclear power plants. Great big tall walls, 40-foot walls, 8 feet thick. And they never know what's going on the outside. There could be plagues, there could be fires, there could be nuclear wars. They don't care. They got their 80-foot walls, 8 feet thick, and they're living inside, and they got their farmland, and they got their slaves and their machines and their AI, and they're good. They don't care. Well, what is that? 50,000 people? 100,000 people? Seriously, what are we talking about here? How many people can go to Mars? 3,000 people? The numbers are tiny, 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 tiny numbers. Not even worth calculating. And the rest of us are just going to have to figure it out. And maybe 80 million of us figure it out. That's 1% of the current population. Maybe it's 8 million, 1/10 of 1%. The numbers don't lie. The numbers do not lie. And you can have your unicorns and your rainbows and your, rub your lucky rabbit's foot and, hope on a prayer and your lucky stars and everything else. And physics, baby. We're in the grip of physics now. Oh, you can escape a lot of shit. You can't escape the laws of physics. This is going down. It's going. It is on. We are in the jaws of this disaster. And in this environment, parents, new couples, young women are wondering if they want to have children. Good point. That's a really excellent point. Now, me at my age, 65, it doesn't really occur to me, but I have adult children and they're, in relationships and they might be thinking about having kids. And, what do they think about that? Is it worth it? Are you birthing someone into a world that's just going to grind them up and turn them into bone meal, fertilizer, right? So do you really want to do that? Do you want the heartache? Do you want to run around every day, pulling your hair out, trying to find food, clothing, and shelter for your children, even when they're adults? Is that what you want to spend the rest of your life doing? Hey, your responsibility to yourself is to survive. And do you really want to be responsible for someone else's survival too, when you're just going to be running around trying to survive yourself? And then, of course, there's the burden of children. Small children are a burden. They just are. You have to carry them. You have to feed them. They cry, and of course they get sick, and then they're a burden on your heart. And, even if you do the best for your kids, if things aren't working out, and around you, everywhere you look, children are dying of whatever, malnutrition, or war, or exposure to the weather, heat, death, diseases running rampant with all this death going on. Do you really want to live your life like that? Maybe not. So maybe if you're 20 something, 25, and you're looking at the world as it is now, and you're getting a sense that worse is coming, and no one's really helping, no one's really talking about it, and you're like, doesn't look good. It just doesn't look good. Wow. I can't even afford housing. Here I am. I'm 25, 28 years old. I got a job, and it pays okay, but let's face it, the price of housing is way out of reach here in the United States of America. Or you can go live in some stupid place where you can't even find a job. It's not that the cost of housing is so expensive everywhere. It's just that when you find a house you can afford, it's in the middle of no place at all. As we used to say when I was growing up, it's in the middle of Egypt, right? And you don't work in Egypt. You work in downtown San Francisco, downtown Austin, downtown, Boston. You can't live in Egypt and have your job. You can live in Egypt and milk goats and make cheese. I mean, you can do something, right? But you can't have the job you have now. You can't afford to live in this country unless you have 3.5, 4 salaries, and you and your spouse, you and your partner, you're doing the best you can, but you can't even get out of your student debt. Least of all, take on another debt like a $2 million mortgage that you got to pay off in 30 years. How are you going to pay off a mortgage in 30 years? You don't even know that the economy is going to survive. And what happens when you lose your job, and you both lose your job, and the monetary system implodes, and the entire economy implodes, and there's no work to have anywhere? Or AI takes everybody's job and leaves you out on the street, with all your office goods, and you're standing there in the middle of the street wondering what just happened. I just got laid off. I just got fired. No good reason. Oh, why? I think I know the reason. They replaced us all with artificial intelligence. So here you are, and your spouse, you have to call your spouse and say, I got some news. It ain't good. Plus you got 2 little children. You got 2 teenage children. Is that what you want? Good question. So I sometimes hear people saying, and often enough, it's climate scientists, women climate scientists are saying, I don't have any kids, and knowing what I know, I don't know that I want to bring a child into that world, the world that's coming. Because, you have a child today, the child will be 10 years old about the time that the shit hits the fan in a big, big, serious way. You have a 10-year-old kid, a 12-year-old kid. Wow. Holy moly. And people are increasingly having that thought. It starts with the scientists, of course, because we know what's coming. We get it. You don't have to tell me. I know exactly what's coming. I know exactly. I can almost tell you when it's going to hit. I can almost tell you what it's going to look like. There's not many mysteries here, folks. There's not many. There's not much unknown about this. All right. I know the politicians will tell you the science is unsettled, but that's what they're supposed to tell you, because they want you to keep on and keeping on. They don't want you panicking. They don't want you going to Washington and demanding answers. They don't want to see you, and they don't want you protesting, and they don't want you, electing people who are, populists and promise the moon and the stars and every child a pony. They don't want to lose their power to mad people who promise the sun and the moon. So that they just keep it to themselves. And the climate scientists who do good work, they publish their papers, and the IPCC process picks them up every 7 or 8 years, and then they rewrite them and summarize them. 2 million words worth of research results, and they summarize it down to 850 words in a summary, an executive summary for policymakers. 850, 1,000 words. Really? You're going to take 8 years of climate research and all the complexity and all the background knowledge you have to have, and and all the prognostications and all the caveats and all the error bars. You're going to take all that. You're going to summarize that in 850 words for policymakers. Well, go ahead, I guess. I mean, if that's what you're going to do, fine. I can't stop you. Seems like it's stupid. But on the other hand, no one looks at this stuff anyway. So fine, go and do whatever you want to do. It doesn't even matter what they do every 7 years with the climate data. Doesn't matter what they do. Doesn't change the fact that we have 235,000 excess births per day. That's increasing our population of the earth by 85 million per year. And I am not saying that births are bad or that there's excess population. What I'm saying is that when we stop burning fossil fuels, which we must, then the carrying capacity of this planet, meaning if you remove the artificial habitat that we have created using fossil fuels, if you remove that, then the carrying capacity of this raw planet, just the trees and the streams and the rivers and the oceans and the fish and the wildebeest herds and the planet raw probably can't support even 80 million people. And that's 1% of the current population. Now, population is not the problem. Population is just not sustainable. It's just not. And people are going to die. What cannot be sustained won't be sustained. That's it. That's all there is to it. Now, do you want to give birth into that? Maybe not. And I can't advise anyone on how to make that decision. It's a deeply personal decision, and I don't know what to tell you. I will tell you this. There was a time, not too long ago, 100 years ago, when large families were the norm. Large families were normal. It wasn't unusual for a woman in her reproductive lifetime to give birth to 12 kids, 15 kids. Now, of course, a lot of them died, but it doesn't matter. She was pregnant and gave birth, 12, 15 times. And, that was hard on her. Women's bodies didn't hold up very well. And at the end of their lives, their bodies were completely broken down. But large families were the norm. And why is that? Because you had to work the land for every morsel of food you were going to eat, and possibly to have a little bit extra to sell into your community. It just took everybody. And sons were really useful because sons could manage the animals and plow the fields with the oxen and cut down the trees and saw up the lumber. And of course, they would provide security as well. If you had a lot of sons, you were doing pretty good. And the daughters can be put to work, right? The daughters make the cheese and the daughters do the sewing and, the daughters do the less physical stuff. And eventually you marry your daughters off and they go away. They're part of some other family now. So, that's not the best, but, your sons would help take care of you. So you had a lot of children in the hopes that you would have 3 or 4 really strong, healthy sons who could, run the farm. Because that was how you ate. That's where your food came from. And maybe a little bit of income. And maybe from that income, you could buy some of the things you couldn't make for yourself. Sugar, flour, cooking oil, needles for sewing, thread for sewing, things hard to make yourself. Although there are, peoples in the world who do make all those things. And before industrialization, everybody made everything. You wanted a wooden spoon, you carved a wooden spoon out of a piece of wood. You wanted a wooden bowl, well, you had to have the right chisels and the spoon bits and all that stuff, and you could chisel a bowl out of wood. That's how you had a bowl. People just made things, make chairs, make tables, make their house from local materials. And then, of course, we started making money by having jobs, generally factory jobs. But you got the money, and then you could buy things that you couldn't make anymore because you no longer lived in a natural habitat. You no longer had access to the soil. You didn't have access to the fisheries. You didn't have access to the forest. You were living in a city. So you had to have a job, and you got the money, and you bought the things that you could no longer produce for yourself. That's how it worked. And when you lived in the city and you had to buy everything you needed, then children became something of a liability. I mean, you still love your children. Women want to have children. They yearn to have children. Little babies are so cute. And, a baby's not that hard to take care of. The baby just wants to breastfeed, and you just clean its nappy every so often. And, babies are fine. And then they get a little older, and then they need clothing, and then they need to go to school. And then, then they get childhood illnesses, and then they break a leg, and, they become more and more expensive. And so when people were living in the cities, women just stopped having children. And some of the women had to work in factories anyway. It's not a great place to be pregnant, right? So they just stopped having babies. But for the women that lived on the farm, having a lot of babies, having large families was still a big deal. And, you lost a lot of your children. And sometimes you lost your mothers because of complications. So, it was nip and tuck as to whether it was going to work at all for your farm. And eventually, it did. Here we are now at 8,000 million people. So something worked out. We got to that point. As we begin to transition into this new world in the future, where we don't have fossil fuels anymore, we transition into this new world in the future where we have to provide for ourselves, for resilience. There's not going to be fossil fuels to fill the shelves at your supermarket with food from all over the world. There's not going to be fossil fuels necessarily to bring water to your tap. So you just turn a tap and there's the water. You may have to go to the river, come back with buckets of water. If you have a river, right? There's not going to be fossil fuels to give you all the medicines you need on demand in a little bottle with the pills in it, and you just take the pill and you feel better, right? It's going to be hard to be diabetic. It's going to be hard to have kidney disease. It's going to be hard to break a bone. It's going to be very difficult if you get an infection. And, it's just everything's going to be difficult. And of course, you're constantly having to deal with food, water, clothing, shelter, just this constant grind of every single day. You have to figure it out again today and the day after and the day after that. And this generation and the next generation and the generation after that. Every single time, everybody, every generation, the elders, the little ones, the middle people, the adults are going to figure it out. What can I do? What can I do today? What did I do yesterday that worked? What did I do yesterday that didn't work? Okay, I won't do that again. But the things that did work, now I have to try those again. Do I have enough resources? Do I have seed? Do I have water? Do I have a plow? My oxen got stolen. My horse died. What am I going to do? How am I going to pull a plow? Parents are old. They can't do it anymore. Now the sons and the daughters have to rise up and fill in those roles. And the daughters have to have children. And the daughters need husbands. And where are the husbands coming from? And are they any good? Do they know anything? Do they have any skills? And are they going to be good husbands to these daughters? And are these daughters going to have children? Will the children survive? That's what we're heading into. That's our future. Now, it's a little bit like our past, but in the past, they had streams that flowed with clean water. In the past, they had herds of wild animals, herds of deer in the forest. The bison in North America just blackened the plains. The herds are so big. And they had the skills. They knew what to do. They had acquired the skills over 10,000 years. 10,000 years of just every generation picking up and running with the skills, the methods, the knowledge that came from the prior generations, and just picking it up and taking it forward a little every year, every generation, a little bit further forward. Got us where we are today. Here we are, 8,000 million people. Wow, what a ride, right? But it was those people every day getting out there, every day yoking up the ox, every day plowing the field, every day harvesting the crops, every day preserving the food, every day innovating, figuring out how to make things, smelting iron, making nails, sawing lumber, every day, doing it, and slowly progressing and getting further along and getting a little further ahead, more food, more lumber, more automation, more innovation, steam engines, driven with coal and wood, and then internal combustion engines and trucks and cranes and tractors, and just every generation a little further, a little further, a little further. That's what got us here. But that's not our future. We don't get to do that. We don't get to progress. We don't get to be the ones who do better somehow, for some definition of better. I mean, it wasn't always better, right? There were some ugly episodes in there, generation to generation to generation. Institutionalized slavery, institutionalized imperialism, capitalism, worker exploitation, mechanized warfare, atomic bombs, genocides. There's a long list of just bullshit that should have been avoided, could have been avoided, maybe not. Maybe we're just a bunch of chimps with weapons. Who knows what our fate was going to be? Well, we know we've got to where we are now, 8,000 million people. But as we go forward, this is path dependent. The way we got here is not how we go forward. We can't reproduce any of those steps. We have to go forward into a world that is not the same, that is depleted, that is full of people. We have to go into a world where there are national boundaries. And some of these countries with boundaries have nuclear weapons or mechanized warfare. It's different. It's different. It used to be that you could just go over that mountain ridge and there's another valley on the other side, not a soul living in it. There's a herd of deer and there's a creek and there's a pond and there's all this lumber, and it was fine. You could just do that. Now you can't do that anymore. You can't do that. You can't do that. That's not an option. You're stuck where you are. It had better work. Where you're at right now had better fucking work. If it doesn't fucking work, then you're fucking dead. Okay, that's your future. If where you are isn't going to work, if you don't have the things you need to have, then your future is a shallow grave, if you're lucky. Maybe not even that. That's our future. Being in the right place at the right time. Luck. Okay, maybe some skill, but probably some luck. Maybe if you're a billionaire, then money will pave the way, right? Money will grease the skids. What if you're not a billionaire? Then what are your options going to be? Not good. Do you want to bear children into that? Now, if you recreate in this future village life, I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like. I mean, I can make some guesses. It's not bad. It doesn't have to be bad. Then you're going to have a similar problem that people had 300 years ago. You're going to need people. You're going to need people who understand the challenges. And maybe you can bring people in from outside who knock at the gate of your village, because your village has a wall around it. And they knock at the gate and they say, "Hi, what are you guys doing in there?" "Oh, well, we're surviving." "Oh, I see that. Can I join you? I don't know. Do you have any skills?" "Oh, sure. I mean, I can sew clothing. I can make shoes. I can make hats. I've all kinds of skills. I can carve wood. I'm a carpenter. I'm a bricklayer. I'm a potter. I can make pots out of clay. Do you need any of those skills?" "Oh, yeah, we really do." So you invite them in. Well, what's probably going to happen is that everybody on the outside of your fence is the enemy, or at least they're suspicious, right? They could even have diseases you've never heard of. So probably if someone knocks on the gate, you tell them to go away. So where do your people come from? They come from families. Old-fashioned way, right? Women choosing mates who suit them, and the couples having children, and the community basically raising up, protecting the children, making sure the children get fed and they get educated. But what are the children learning? They're learning whatever's already happening inside the village. They learn from their parents. They learn from the elders. They learn from the blacksmith next door, and they work in the fields and they help with the harvest. Then they learn how to harvest. They learn how to plant, and they know how to, where the wheat comes from. The wheat for the bread came from, the miller. The flour came from the miller, and the miller has a stone, and he grinds the wheat berries and the stone, and the flour comes out. And where the wheat berries come from? They came from the field. And I was out there last year with the other children, helping to harvest the wheat, and we worked on the threshing floor, and we got the wheat separated from the chaff. And before that, we had to plant the wheat. We were broadcasting wheat seeds out in the field. And before that, we had to plow and harrow the field. And so they just know all this. They're born into it. The women in the community, they had the children, they selected their mates, and they were happy, and they're happy to have children. And they, of course, had plenty of children. Childhood mortality is not a done deal, right? We don't know that's going away. And, and at that point, you do want to have children. They are literally your future. You as a person are going to rely on your own children and the other children of the community to do the planting and do the harvesting, so you can be old and full of wisdom and full of ideas and full of leadership, but you're old and you're not going to go out there and do that hard work anymore and deal with the animals and fix the plow when it's broken and make the nails on the anvil, but you're going to be home. And what are you going to be doing? Well, you're going to be taking care of the tiniest generation, the new ones, the little babies, right? And their mothers are going to be around, and the mothers are nursing the infants, and the old people are taking care of the toddlers and taking care of and teaching them how to read, how to write, teaching them how the world works. The elders are passing on the wisdom to the youngest generation, while the middle people, the 20-somethings, the 30-somethings, are out working in the field, working with the animals, working at the anvil, carpenters, potters, millers. All these families are all these capabilities. And that's just how it is. And you need a lot of people. And in that situation, if a woman wants to have 12 children, she has 12 children. It's not a big deal. As long as she doesn't mind doing it, doesn't mind nursing 12 babies, doesn't mind, throwing her body into doing all that work of, being pregnant and birthing children and taking care of them until they can take care of themselves. So long as she doesn't mind doing that, then she's certainly welcome to do it. And there will be heartaches, of course. There will be illnesses. There will be accidents. There will be wars. There will be all kinds of terrible things could happen in the future, continue to happen. And just about the time we've established all these villages and all these people are working together and they figured out how to, use animals to plow the fields and all that stuff, well, we could still have a nuclear war. The elites end up with all the nuclear weapons, could decide one day that they want to blow up the world, blow up the other people. You can't have more money than me. I've got a nuclear bomb. And maybe that's what happens. Maybe we figure all this out and have all these children and we have this perfect system and the elders are taking care of the babies and the adults are taking care of the village and the village is growing and the sons and the daughters are moving out and other sons and daughters move in. You got daughter-in-laws and sons-in-laws and everyone is happy and the children are happy and everything's working fine. And then a nuclear bomb falls on you. That would suck. But that's kind of how humans do things. Too bad, right? We didn't figure that part out. Too bad. Wow, Jeff Bezos got a nuclear bomb. And he decided he didn't want to be on the same planet as Elon Musk, whose gambit of going to Mars didn't work out. And those two hate each other. And they've both got nuclear weapons. They've got mechanized drone armies. And they just go to war with each other. And we're all stuck in the middle. You, me, the dog, right? We're all stuck in the middle of that. Could happen. That would suck. But we're hoping it doesn't happen because we can't stop it. If those guys hate each other and they want to go to war and they've got all the weapons and they've got all the bots and they've got all the guns and the bullets and everything else, and we're stuck in between them, then sucks to be us, right? And as I've said before, the people 1,000 years from now, maybe 500 years from now, who survived through all of this turmoil and angst and change and negative progress as we, contract from 8,000 million to 80 million or maybe even 8 million, right? Reverse growth. 500 years from now, people who look back will have a story to tell. And, the old elder, puffing on a pipe, sitting in a rocking chair that someone made by hand, will have the little, grandchildren, great-grandchildren collected around their feet. And tell us again, Grandpa, how do we get here? Well, kids, it's like this. And this is how the world used to be. And then there was that happened. And then there was this thing called fossil fuels, and it was a bad idea. It made sense at the time, but they had to give it up. And when they gave it up, it was almost too late. And a bunch of people died, and Our ancestors didn't, and they survived, and they got lucky, and they figured out how to make villages all over again from scratch. And they had plows, and they had seeds, and they had access to soil. And the soil came with water, and the rains fell when they needed to fall and not when they didn't need to fall. And when the war between the Bezoses and the Musks took place, we were 1,000 miles away in the other direction, so we didn't have to worry about it. We still work the same soil. We're very careful with our soil. We make sure we don't take too much out of it. And you've all watched us put the manure on the soil and how we tend to the soil, and we test it and we get the right kind of harvest from it. And everything's very careful. And I've been teaching you children how we do everything. And it's going to come your turn. You're going to get out there and you're going to do it. And when you get out there and you do it just the way we're doing it right now, then that ensures another generation. Because that means you're going to have food to eat. The fact that your parents are out there means you have food to eat. And when you're an adult, then you're going to have to work those fields, and then your children will have food to eat. And they will remember how they got that food. And you're learning it right now from your parents. And then you're going to be the parents. You're going to be the mommy and the daddy. And you're going to work that hard work, and you're going to come up with the successes, and you're going to feed your children. And that's how we do it now. It's been 500 years of doing that. And we're the lucky ones. We got lucky. We had the skills. We had the smarts. We got in early. We didn't let anyone stop us. And we're the lucky ones. And from where we are right now in our little village with stuff we made by hand, and the walls we put up, and the herds that we've grown, and the forest that we've replanted, from where we are right now, from this location, you'd have to go 200 miles to find another village. That's how few villages there are. It's a 4-day journey to the next village. 4 days on a horse. You can walk it. Takes a month. That's what they'll tell their grandchildren. This is how we do it. This is what we did. That's why we're here. All these things that you just take for granted, that's why we're here. It's not trivial. And it's not an accident. And it's exactly what it took. And the people who couldn't figure out what we figured out aren't here to talk. They're not here. They're not here. They don't have any story to tell. And I'm an old person, and I'm here in front of you, and I'm able to tell you the stories of how we got here, because we got here, because we survived. And everybody else who couldn't figure out survival, they didn't survive. They have no story to tell. And maybe they had freedoms, and maybe they had money, and maybe they had armies, and they were raiding other villages, and they were cutting down the forests, and they were diverting the rivers, and stealing the grain, and they did all these things. But that turned out not to be the answer. And now they're dead. And everybody who's figured it out, they're alive. So keep doing what we do. And that's what we're here to teach you. It's what works. And raiding the next town over doesn't work. You have to be resilient. You have to be self-sufficient. You have to have the skills. Your whole village has to pull together. When it's harvest time, you have to be out there. And you see your parents doing that, it's going to come your turn. And that's going to be the story 500 years from now. When the elders are sitting in their rocking chair smoking a pipe, and the children are gathered around their feet, and they want to hear the story. Tell us the story, Grandpa. Tell us how it was, Grandma. Tell us again what we need to know. And then the question, do I have children or not, won't even be on anyone's mind. Have as many kids as you want. Don't have any. But every child is the future. Every child is how you will survive. Every child will grow up to pull their part of the weight, or to be the next round of mothers, or to be the next round of fathers, or both. Every child that you give birth to will be taught how to do something, will know how to do something. And maybe some of the children will invent new things. Who knows? I mean, that's how we got here. That's how we got to 8,000 million people, is every generation had somebody who invented something new. There were a lot of Thomas Edisons. There were a lot of Henry Fords in the last 10,000 years. And now it's our turn. We have to figure it out. So, to the question of should you have children, it depends on your situation, and I'm not going to pretend to, uh, you know, uh, give a blanket answer to that. I think that if you want to have any hope for your children, if you want to save yourself a lot of heartache as you watch your children deal with what's coming, then you need to recreate village life. You need to surround yourself with like minded people. You need to raise your children together. You need to do all the things the adults need to do so that there's enough for the children. You need to protect your children. You need to build walls. And you also protect your children by building walls of community. When you have a community, that's a kind of a boundary. It's a virtual boundary, but it works. It still works. You know who you belong to. Everyone knows what they're supposed to do. There's no question of how we're going to get through this. There's no question when you're supposed to plant the seeds. There's no question that you're going to harvest it and when you're going to harvest it and what you're going to do with the harvest. There's no questions about any of these things. And knowing what you're supposed to do is a kind of fortress. It's a fortress in which you don't really have to be so concerned about whether you're having children or not. And once you find yourself in this virtual fortress, this village, and maybe there's real walls and maybe they're just walls of cooperation. People are outside the circle and people are inside the circle. And the circle is just the village life. And maybe it's hard to get in. Maybe it's even hard to get out. It's a construct. And once you have that, your ideas about your freedoms and your responsibilities are going to change completely. And into that world, into this world that we now have to pursue, and we've got maybe 20 years in which to do that. And as we're moving towards a world of more self-reliance, more resilience, more stability, and a more focused relationship with nature. And I don't mean nature like hippie nature, like loving Mother Nature. I mean, with your surroundings, with your natural habitat. As we get more tuned into our natural habitat, we are going to have to adopt ways of doing things that are completely alien to us now, because nobody has that relationship with nature. Most people don't even have access to natural habitat. And yet you're going to have to rediscover that, because without fossil fuels, all you're going to have is natural habitat. And without fossil fuels, all you're going to have is your community. You're not going to be able to make it alone. Period. Just not going to happen. And, we're going to have 400 million excess deaths a year as we collapse from 8,000 million humans to 80 million humans. 80 million humans right now is our excess births per year. 80 million right now, excess births. We will have 80 million total population, zero excess births, and 40 million excess deaths over a 20-year period as we give up on fossil fuels. And that sounds incredible. 20 years for many women who are now of childbearing age, 20, right? Thinking about having children. 20 years is your child rearing life. You'll be 40. You will have had all your kids. You'll be done, completely done. And if you're 20 right now and you're thinking about having kids and you're wondering if you should, your entire world is going to change in the next 20 years. Over the next 20 years, you're not going to recognize life in 20 years. The changes are going to be so comprehensive. And the only thing I can tell you is that you will, in order to survive, in order to be among that 80 million people left on the planet, after 400 million people, one entire US population dies per year for 20 years. When you find yourself at the end of 20 years, there's no fossil fuels and you're alive, you're in a village. That's your situation. At that point, 20 years from now, you're still alive. You will have discovered your village. You'll be surrounded by your Dunbar number, 200 people, maybe 150, and you'll have everything you need figured out. Because if you didn't, you're dead. And if you did figure it out, you're alive. And you get to be the person who gets to be an elder, who gets to tell the story of how you all survived. 20 years. We got 20 years to go through that entire shit show of getting off of fossil fuels, losing 400 million people per year, excess deaths. 400 million. During which time, over 20 years, we lose fossil fuels, learn to live without them, and we end up having a die-off of at least 99% of the human race right now. This is inconceivable. Everything I just described is inconceivable. And yet, it's all indicated by the laws of physics. Global heating is a thing. Carbon emissions have got to stop. Not net zero, zero, the actual number zero. And as soon as they stop, you're going to have excess deaths because people can't feed themselves and they can't clothe themselves and they can't heat themselves and there's going to be no water and no crops and no nothing because it's all 100% dependent on fossil fuels. And as soon as we even start to pare down our consumption of fossil fuels, whether we do it on the first year or the 20th year, whenever we start to do that, then the die-off begins. The die-off is that's when it starts. And if we were to space it out over 20 years, it would be 400 million people per year to go from 8,000 million to 80 million. 400 million people per year. One entire United States of America, plus some, every year. It's just inconceivable. And yet, those are the numbers. Welcome to math. Welcome to physics. And if you think that you can somehow in the next 20 years, well, preferably the next 5, if you think you can recreate village life and start living without fossil fuels and doing the hard work, then yeah, you should probably think about having children. You will need them. They will work. And if they're daughters, they will have children of their own. And if they're sons, they'll be out working in the fields and working with the animals. And everybody's going to bring in the harvest. And everybody's going to share the food. And if you can find a village and surround yourself with a village and contribute to the village and be a welcomed, productive member of the village, then yeah, in 20 years, you're going to be having lots of children. Everyone's going to be a parent. And, children will be a blessing. But that's village life. That's nearly everyone is involved in agriculture or some form of production, something, weaving, sewing, cheese making, whatever. Tanning leather, whatever it is, thousands of things. There's 1,000 things. It's a list of 1,000 things we have to reinvent how to do, rediscover, relearn, 1,000 things. Carving spoons out of wood. That's one thing. Making chairs out of wood. Rocking chairs, tables. That's 2 things. Either one of those things is a lifetime of learning for somebody. And you have 1,000 things. Do you have 1,000 people? No. And yet that's the challenge of the next 20 years. That is the challenge. And our attitudes about having kids will change completely. As well it ought. Because this is the end of industrialization. Fossil fuel usage is going to drop to essentially zero. And the Musks and the Bezoses and the Gateses and, I guess they'll have their private refineries and their private oil stocks, and they'll still have fossil fuels for whatever stupid use. Private jets. I mean, who knows what they're going to use with their fossil fuels? But it'll be nothing, and nothing for you and nothing for me. And they'll get theirs, and they'll be flying around in their private jets, and who cares, right? They're like a whole nother species at that point. Who's feeding them? I don't know what their story's going to be. I don't care. Whose story do I care about? My story, your story. And we are going to be villagers. We have to figure that out. And once we're villagers, we'll suddenly remember, oh yeah, children. How could I have forgotten the importance of children? We have a lot of work to do. And along the way, people will remember why they had children, what to do with them, how to take care of them, and how to work, how to make a village. And part of the duty of the village is to produce and take care of the children. Village life. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. Again, this is about death, but also about life, having kids within a different context. It's not you and your partner trying to figure out whether you can afford to have kids. It's about breaking out of this trap and getting into a completely different way of life, which I'm calling village life. And once you're in village life, then you'll remember why we had children. Don't forget to subscribe, give me a like, and we'll be back to do more of this, whatever it is I do. Ta.